Today's panel is on scaling offshore wind energy in Massachusetts. Despite having excellent geographic potential for utilizing offshore wind, Massachusetts is still working to bring its first commercial offshore wind farm online. What's been causing this holdup and what progress has been made? Today, we'll discuss some of the barriers and opportunities facing the offshore wind industry in Massachusetts. Topics will include equitable development, transmission and infrastructure challenges, and technological innovation.
Hi, everyone, and I would like to introduce our amazing moderator, Rebecca Wolf, who is a PhD student at the Offshore Wind Energy Department at Tufts University. She gained her bachelor's degree in engineering from Smith College, her master's degree from Tufts University, and her current research is focused on net zero pathways by 2050. So please welcome Rebecca Wolf, and we will start our panel.
Thank you. So thanks everybody for being here today. This is going to be a really great panel. I hope you're ready. Just a quick housekeeping note. We will be having questions at the end of the panel. So if you have questions, please hang on to them and wait until the very end. You will get a chance to ask them, I promise. So first of all, let me introduce our great lineup of panelists. First, we have Bruce Carlisle. He is the Managing Director of Offshore Wind for the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. He directs programs and initiatives, including ports, workforce and supply chain development, marine studies and characterization, planning and siting, and finally, research and innovation. So thank you for being here today, Bruce. Second, we have Vandin Devatia. He's the Vice President of Transmission, Policy, and Compliance at Eversource. He is shaping policy and strategy to enable the grid of the future to be designed, constructed, and operated reliably and cost effectively. Vandin has held positions in operations, economic planning, business development, strategy and compliance, and has led the evaluation of numerous renewable energy projects from a reliability, economic, and environmental perspective. So thank you, Vandin, for being here today. Third, we have Dr. Eric Hines, who I'm expecting many of our audience knows because he's a professor here at Tufts. He is the director of the Offshore Wind Energy Graduate Program here, so I know him pretty well. He's a professor of the practice in structural engineering. He's also the president of Hines & Partners, a consulting firm specializing in offshore wind energy, structural design, and engineering creativity. He works with the technology policy interface to develop systems-level design concepts and has received numerous awards for his work in his industry-driven research. So thank you for being here today. Finally, last but not least, we have Peter Shattuck. He's the president of New England Projects at Anbaric, which specializes in the design, development, financing, and construction of large-scale electric transmission systems. Prior to joining Anbaric, he served as director of the Clean Energy Initiative and Massachusetts director at Acadia Center, where he worked to develop state and regional programs supporting offshore wind, energy efficiency, clean energy transmission, energy storage, and market-based climate policy. So can we have a round of applause for our four panelists? So the first question, hopefully an easy one to get you guys warmed up, is how big of a role do you think offshore wind is going to play in Massachusetts' energy portfolio for the future? And what do you think the single biggest barrier or obstacle is to getting to that goal? And let's start with Bruce. We'll go down the line.
Check. Excellent. Thank you, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here. 15 seconds, Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. We're a state economic development agency with a focus, obviously, on the clean energy sector. Our goal is to support the Commonwealth in meeting its very aggressive climate goals, which include net zero by 2050. It's a good segue into the question from Rebecca. How do we get there? In our decarbonization roadmap that was released a couple of years ago, and the Commonwealth continues to together the pathways and scenarios, revisit those. But It's fair to say that across a number of different scenarios, offshore wind will present the bulk of the renewable energy generation for the Commonwealth. So in order to meet our goals, we're looking at something like 15 to 25 gigawatts of offshore wind for the Commonwealth alone. And then you can look down for the ISO New England region and down the Atlantic seaboard, and you will see offshore wind for much of the US is a really key part of achieving our climate goals. Put that 15 to 25 in some sort of context for the next 25 years, that's roughly half to a gigawatt a year of deployment. So the scaling issue that was sort of introduced in the beginning of the panel is going to be a really good theme for us to explore this morning. In terms of obstacles, sort of torn on this because there are a lot, but we're also continuing to make steady progress, both in terms of the U.S. industry and in particular here in Massachusetts, which continues to be at the forefront among states who are really active in this space and have invested heavily and are, very much supportive of the industry. So 2 quick responses, and I'll pass it down. If I had to sort of sum it up. On the scaling issue, we do not have the infrastructure in place, so we need ports and vessels. This is very sort of distinct from onshore wind. The scale of the infrastructure that we're talking about, offshore wind, is a uniquely maritime industry. The components in their sort of unfinished and finished state need to be moved by water. We do not have in the US the port facilities ready for the industry, and we need to scale. And I'll talk more about that. And Massachusetts has made some very early investments, and we benefited from the expertise of Professor Hines and the development construction of our New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal, which is right now the nation's only purpose-built offshore wind port. In addition to ports and vessels, supply chain. And then I'll hand it off to these guys. I'll tee these guys right up because I'm going to say transmission is going to be probably the single biggest issue after we get some of that other stuff right in building our fixed bottom offshore wind projects. Vandana.
Thank you. Quick question. No, it's okay. So you mentioned a couple great things, especially about like the scaling issue. So for our audience, does anyone know how big offshore wind turbines can be? To put this into perspective. Does anyone know? Does anyone want to guess?
The largest ones are close to being as far as Empire State.
Yeah, so these are some of the very big structures. As another example, the GE Haliade X turbine, the blades are 107 meters long, a single blade. So these are some very big structures. Sorry, Bandit, your turn.
So I'll just tee off on that. How important is offshore wind going to be for New England? Bruce mentioned some megawatt numbers, but do folks in this room understand the concept of a capacity factor? What that means is, a solar resource generates X% of the year. A wind resource generates Y% of the year. Offshore wind has one of the largest capacity factors amongst clean energy resources available to the New England region. Almost 45% capacity factor, which means you put a 1,200 megawatt offshore wind project, it's generating 4 terawatt hours of energy. You would need probably 2 to 3 times more of a solar nameplate capacity resource to compensate for that. While it's intermittent, it still compensates for a lot of the energy that New England needs and offsets gas and other fossil-based demand. So it is going to be a very important part of the New England future. The way we look at it, in my role, my team's done this, so have many other states. We look at it in 3 decades. What do we need between now and 2030? What do we need by 2040 and then by 2050? I think looking at it in that organized manner allows you to scale up without compromising reliability. because for the first decade, you're still going to need balancing resources that are primarily natural gas. The second decade, that dependence really reduces significantly. And by the third decade, it's really non-existent because you have other clean energy balancing resources. So it's a no-brainer that offshore wind is going to be a key part of the clean energy transition in New England. But one of the barriers is that, you know, it does not have enough, it has a lot of challenges, whether you go from the generators, you know, the developers of the wind turbines, to the developers of the transmission that connect the wind turbines to the shore, and then transmission onshore. So you kind of have to break it up in various buckets when you think about what are the barriers for offshore wind. Is it on the development side? Is it on the policy side? Is it on the cost side? And I think you start chipping away at those issues one at a time. Versus handling the workforce development, Eversource is very actively making sure the transmission system onshore is able to accept the next decade or 15 years of offshore wind. And we have plans today that we can create the foundation onshore to accept the next 15 gigawatts of offshore wind. Beyond that, we still need to have significant more plans, but that's just onshore, and Peter will talk about some of the transmission investments needed offshore. So I feel like it's a combination. There's a lot of challenges, but the one thing New England can't do is slow down or pause. If you look at New York, and Eversource's JV is a part of this development, they're starting to develop wind, and there's already projects that are going to be in service, significant amount of projects that are going to be in service. So we can't slow down. We have to start chipping away at the challenges in different buckets, and have a very collaborative process that lets everyone get to the table and solve each part of their supply chain.
All right.
Dr. Hines, your turn.
Thank you. So with that context, I think that my counterparts have done a very good job of describing what the opportunities are and what the challenges are, and how important a role offshore wind will play in New England and along the entire East Coast, and ultimately the nation and the world. And so what I'd like to, as a scholar, I like to take a historical perspective on things, and the history I'd like to talk about is just maybe in the last 10 years. We're in a historic moment right now where a lot of times we kind of tacitly assume, whether we describe it or not, that things grow like this. But in reality, things often grow like this. They're flat for a long time. There's a lot of groundwork, and then all of a sudden they shoot straight up. And we're in one of these shooting straight up moments. And so this is what's exciting, and it's what's an opportunity, and it's also what's a challenge at the exact same time. How does a federal organization such as the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management increase its staff by a factor of 400% as quickly as it needs to in order to be able to permit these projects? How do we, who have very few programs in the country to educate students to enter into this industry, educate enough people to enter into the workforce that's hiring right now? There are tremendous opportunities at play. And so I just want to mention a couple of things. There was a period of about 5 years where the cost of the turbines went down by a factor of 3. And the size of the turbines went up by a factor of 3. One could even argue, 4 or 5. In my lifetime, it has not at all been common to see things change by a factor of even 2, let alone a factor of 3 or an order of magnitude. Most of our thinking as engineers has always been about, well, this last 10%, how do we sort of fuss around with the last 10%? And we're at a moment right now where the 10% will always be important, but right now the order of magnitude is much more important than anything else. And so we're thinking in orders of magnitude. And maybe the best example I could give you of that is that the end of 2014, Cape Wind, we had just finished the Marine Commerce Terminal so that Cape Wind could, after 26 lawsuits, they had won every one of them. Cape Wind was getting ready to stage in 2015, lost its power purchase agreement at the 11th hour, and then all of a sudden renewables and offshore wind were no more in Massachusetts. This is 2015. We had just elected a new governor, and we knew what the new governor was going to do, and it was a very dark year for this kind of thinking. By the end of that month, we actually auctioned off, the American people, through BOEM, auctioned off the first offshore wind lease areas. There had been others that had been auctioned off, but in this particular area, that my colleague Bruce Carlisle was extremely instrumental. in defining this area and working with BOEM and creating this space, those leases went for about $1 an acre. Okay? Now, $1 an acre means that anybody here who's thinking about buying a home, or even a cheap condo anywhere in the neighborhood could have bought one of those leases. We're talking about $274,000 or something like that. This was prior to 2016 and prior to the Massachusetts legislation and the industry coming back to life in its new form, led by Patricia Haddad, representative from Somerset, Speaker pro tem at the time of the House of Representatives, Massachusetts. We created groundbreaking legislation in 2016, the state of Massachusetts did, to procure an actual industry scale. By that time, later on in 2016, the prices in Europe were coming down, they were coming down, and there were talk of even getting to subsidy-less prices. That was by about April 2017. That fall, New York sold its lease area over a 3-day auction to Equinor for $42 million. Now compare that to $274,000. It's about $150 an acre. By 2018, the Vineyard Wind price had come out at under $100 a megawatt hour. Already in the US, the prices were 3 times lower than what they had originally been. Cape Wind was $187, Block Island was $244. And then by December of 2018, the Massachusetts lease area sold for $1,000 an acre. Now that wasn't the end of the story, because February of last year, about a year ago, some other leases in the New York Bight sold for around $10,000 an acre. Now, at this point, everybody just kind of said, hey, this is absurd. We can't keep going up like this because people spend all the money on the lease and they won't have any money to build a wind farm. And this is, the honest truth. But I think what we are living in right now is a moment where things are going like this. And I think we have to understand what that means. And I think we have to figure out how to work with it. It's a very dynamic environment and big things happen, very high highs, very low lows. So as we have individual people that we're bringing into the workforce and trying to plan steadily for 30 years, how do we also manage these tremendous swings that are the result of historic scale?
Thank you, Peter. Your turn.
Yes, and I think my colleagues on the panel have framed it well, so I'll be relatively quick. But just going back to the context and the size, so the 30 to 40 gigawatts that Bruce mentioned that all of New England is going to need, and these are in analyses that Massachusetts did. That's the quantity that's needed to hit the decarbonization goals. That's equivalent to all of the power plants existing in New England. So think of that, you're basically swapping out the capacity. Now it's a little capacity factor, but still very high, as Fondan said. And this time of year, it's a great complement to sunny today, but the days are relatively short, and there's a lot of time when it's not, the sun isn't shining in the winter. So the offshore wind is a great complement, particularly in the winter months when we're constrained on natural gas supply. And then there's an opportunity, maybe for the first time, for Massachusetts and New England to be an energy exporter. We have historically been at the end of the energy pipeline or supply chain, whether that's gas or oil or coal coming in on barges. And given the incredible wind resource we have, very good wind speeds relatively close to shore, there's a chance that New England could actually send power out. And that could be to other states. It could be sending it up to Canada, where it would basically be stored behind hydro reservoirs. So it really is a critical resource. And in terms of the challenges, I think it was teed up well, the infrastructure and particularly the transmission. That grid that we have now was built over the last 100 years, and it's not offshore. It was, to say the obvious, was not anticipating that the major source of energy was going to be tens or hundreds of miles from the demand centers out in the ocean. So we're seeing a progression in New England and in the US that follows what we've seen in other mature markets, particularly in Europe, where the first projects, first wind farms connect via their own project-specific cables. They can find space that's relatively close on the grid and retire power plants. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But then as the first projects come in, it becomes harder and harder to connect the next round of projects. The costs to connect them start to increase. Multiple proposals to bring cables to the same location can create community concern. So the progression then is to separate, to decouple the transmission and the generation. And that enables shared transmission to serve multiple wind farms. So it's fewer power cables. Power cables can go longer distances because you're spreading the cost across multiple wind farms. And this is what we're seeing in Europe, where they are going towards effectively extending the grid out into the ocean and even creating what they're describing as energy islands. So you have all the wind coming into a central point and then power cables that can go out even to multiple different countries. So you can provide power where it's needed, when it's needed. So I think we're at a good point where the states are starting to grapple with that, but that is going to be one of the key challenges.
Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about the challenges of scaling offshore wind, not upshore wind. Let's talk about opportunities. So what are some of the economic benefits and workforce potential does this industry have for Massachusetts communities? And specifically, how do we ensure that these are felt in historically marginalized communities? So I have a wonderful little map. Oh no, it's not working. Oh, okay. Anyway, there's a map, and maybe it will appear. And the map is of environmental justice communities in Massachusetts. So how do we make sure that these communities are benefited by offshore wind? And let's start with Peter. Peter, you got the last word last time, so why don't you start?
Well, I'll talk about one specific project because I know there are a number of programs that I'm sure Bruce and others can talk about, but find their tell a story with a project pretty well. So there is a town called Somerset in on the south coast of Massachusetts, home to Representative Pat Haddad, who Eric referenced, who had a big coal plant in her community for decades. And it was the major source of employment in the local tax base. And so she would proudly call herself the queen of coal. And this takes me back to when I had my old hat on, when I worked for the research and advocacy organization. A lot of the policies on climate that we were trying to push were not ones that she wanted to see because they would damage the operation of the coal plant and employment and jobs. And it's been fascinating over the last few years as largely because of economic factors that coal plant shut down. Natural gas prices dropped and the coal plant was no longer economical. But the critical piece of enabling that transition was painting an alternative picture. So what is the future for this community that has historically been dependent on a coal plant? They have a great resource. They have a robust power grid coming down right next to the water, big 300-acre parcel currently occupied by a coal plant. And so started to think about what does a coal to clean energy transition look like? And now we're seeing it happen. So my company, Enveric, was part of the early development of a proposal to bring wind power into that coal plant site. We sold that to a company called Mayflower Wind, now South Coast Wind, and they are bringing their power cables, proposing to bring their power cables in for their first wind farm. So utilizing the grid capacity. And then probably in a way even more exciting, there's now a proposal to locate an offshore wind transmission cable manufacturing facility on that site as well. So not only will the power cables come in, but there will be manufacturing that will create a significant amount of jobs on that site. It is.
Would you like a laser pointer? Maybe.
Yeah, maybe one.
Yeah, pass it out.
Quick and then hand it off. This is it right here, right on the kind of Rhode Island border. At the top of Mount Hope Bay. So that is Somerset right there, right across from Fall River, which is a historical manufacturing facility, community. That's the history that a lot of those in the Northeast. So, not only is there a chance for the local community itself that was getting the tax revenue to benefit from this transition, but also hopefully to expand to additional populations in the vicinity.
Dr. Hines, do you want to take a step?
Mike? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so I'll try my hand at this.
It's the red button.
Is it the red one?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is New Bedford, and you can see there, this is a community that's been identified on this map. Somerset and Fall River, you can see there. If you go to the North Shore, you can see Salem, and I'm sure that Bruce will talk about that. You come down a little further, you can find Lynn, you can find Everett, find Quincy. Every one of these cities either already has plans or has potential to play a major role in the offshore wind supply chain. One example would be in the town of Lynn. There's an existing GE Aviation manufacturing plant, about a 100-acre facility. I was approached little over a year ago by the IUE-CWA, organized labor, the workers who work in that facility, to ask about the question, what would it be like to manufacture nacelles, GE nacelles in a facility like that? Now, there's a complexity associated with this, and that GE is splitting into 3 different companies, and that plant is owned by the aviation part of the company and not by the renewables part of the company. And so you get into these interesting questions about a city, about its workers, about federal delegations. Senator Markey was at a convening that the workers had in Lynn to talk about this. And you get into a question about states, and which state, every state would like to get a nacelle manufacturing facility. The same group had asked me to assess Schenectady, see whether or not using the GE plant in Schenectady and shipping the nacelles down the Erie Canal would make sense. Ultimately, the Erie Canal, which still functions, is too small and also not available at all times of year to move that kind of nacelle. Mostly it's the overhead restrictions. And so they would have to use the Port of Albany. But these are the kind of assessments that are happening in all these areas. If you go down to Everett, there's that power plant is due to be retired in the near future. Peter's company has made different proposals, really incredible proposals, to bring in offshore wind and use that point of interconnection. It's right across the Mystic River from the Wind Technology Testing Center, again, owned and managed by Bruce's organization, the Mass Clean Energy Center. And so you could imagine a wind turbine blade manufacturing facility right across the water. You could imagine a lot of things using that space. If you come down a little further, there have been proposals time and time again in the city of Quincy, going all the way back to Cape Wind and Mass Tank, and would they stage the monopiles there, and how would they do this? And so I think that a lot of these ideas have been available for a long time. And at the same time, to sort of echo what Peter was talking about Brayton Point, I want to emphasize 300 acres on the water in New England is an extremely rare commodity, And as a matter of fact, all of this, in my opinion, from our experience in New Bedford, comes down to land acquisition and site control. And in New Bedford, we have a 21-acre site that we brought up to about a 24-acre contiguous site. And to do that, we had to actually dismantle a radio tower that had AM cables underground, and it had guy wires, and we had to rebuild the radio tower. So instead of taking up 4 acres, it took up a 1/4 of an acre. That was a pretty significant project to engage just to gain 3.5 acres. But this is exactly the kind of thing that one finds themselves in the middle in as they're working on these sites. And it's really important to understand how critical it is for the public sector to be involved with the private sector in thinking about these things. And these are not issues that the market simply takes care of by itself, that they are highly coordinated. And if anybody remembers, years ago, when we were talking about bringing the GE headquarters to Boston, there was an enormous amount of activity between the city and the state to do all of this. And so what we're talking about in supply chain, it does involve the market, but it involves very high-level decision-making and negotiations and leadership. And these are critical, and these also have to find themselves within a framework and a plan that can support both Massachusetts as well as the region and the country.
Brandon, your turn.
I'll try to bring it down to the project level. So Eversource, through its joint venture with Ørsted, is developing 3 offshore wind projects. South Fork Wind, which is the smallest of the 3, will create 500 direct jobs. And 255 of those will be in New York. And then through supply partnerships, it's going to create 1,400 jobs in the US alone. Sunrise Wind will create, which is a larger project, again, interconnecting into New York, will create 800 direct jobs and thousands of indirect jobs. Revolution Wind, which is interconnecting into Rhode Island, will also create thousands of jobs and economic development opportunities. So that's at the project level on the offshore wind side of the business. On the transmission side of the business, which Eversource actively plays a role and our regulated entity on enabling offshore wind, in my opinion, that is one of the most societal ways to impact EJ communities. Our investments are spread out throughout New England. And when we are impacted communities, there is direct jobs. And I mean, I've personally been to the development of a transmission project in Western Mass when we're developing, it was called the Greater Springfield Reliability Project a decade ago. and we would have open houses, and the restaurants in the local community would be full because there was people visiting the open houses. There'd be vendors who are providing the materials and the services, and they're in that local community. These communities that were in traditionally, EJ or rural areas were buzzing because of the work we were doing. And then at the end of the road, after the work was done, if we're interconnecting a low cost resource into the grid, the benefits of the prices for New England going down because you're not relying on the price spikes by relying on, some of the LNG and natural gas price spike. That societal benefit really impacts all New England customers. So there's multiple ways development of the offshore wind industry can really create workforce development and economic benefits to the region. And here's the expert on this topic.
Right. How much time do we have?
How much time do you need?
More. I can fit it into a few minutes, but I know I could talk all morning, as I'm sure my other panelists could, not just on this topic, but on offshore wind. I think each of the panelists has touched on this, Dr. Hines especially. It's not an overstatement to say that offshore wind presents really a once in a generation opportunity for the United States. We have this massive renewable resource right off our shores. Our partners across the pond, if you will, have been, this mic might be going, have been from
Here, let's.
for decades now. And to give you some numbers, the administration has established a 30 gigawatt by 2030 goal, which is can you talk about it? Talk really loud?
I don't know. Yeah, we already swapped.
Is it too
Yeah.
far? Oh, okay.
There we go.
All right. Here we go. Sorry about that. So it's a really good marker. They've also established a floating wind goal, but let's just talk about 30 by 30. That is about $9 billion capital investment in the United States. For the sort of workforce impacts, that's up to $50,000 jobs in the US. Now, if we get it right, and there are a lot of structural challenges in the US. And if I could take a moment to plug two really good resources from our partners in the federal government at the National Renewable Energy Lab. One is a recent, essentially roadmap for the US offshore wind industry. So if you're sort of interested in offshore wind and you really want to geek out and sort of find out how we're going to get there, that's a great resource. And then every year, NREL puts out essentially a market assessment. So we're detailing some of these goals. At MassCEC, we are working aggressively to help support the Commonwealth, the region, and the industry to connect up the opportunities with the pathways into these jobs. And just to give you a sense of what the sort of occupations look like, they are what we call sort of blue collar, skilled trade jobs that are going to be the individuals who are helping to pre-assemble, construct, install, commission, which span a very large segment of different trades. In the public labor agreement, that Vineyard Wind, which is the first commercial scale project in the US, which will be completing its transmission and starting its offshore wind build in the coming months. Their project labor agreement is 23 different local trades, just to give you a sense of sort of how many entities that touches. So into the trades, which have been sort of historically, let's say, and there are a lot of ways in which we can work with our trade partners to do better on that. And at Mass CEC, one of our major focuses is on the workforce. Since our inception, we've helped grow the clean energy jobs in Massachusetts by 73%. Our numbers in our latest clean energy jobs report is 200,000 total jobs and $28 billion in gross state product. We do this working directly with industry, what the opportunities are, what the specifications and needs are going to be, the credentialing, and working with our partners in labor and academic institutions and organizations to identify their needs and making those investments. So I'm gonna stop now. This mic is driving me crazy. Sorry.
Yeah.
People online, I think that's going to really mess them up.
I don't think our Zoom friends will be able to hear you. So I think you just need to hold it farther away.
Okay.
Yeah, I know it's hard.
I just want to plug a couple things. So right now on the street, you can go onto our webpage and find a great opportunity for offshore wind works. That is our sort of focus investments in offshore wind workforce. But at the same time, you can also find two great opportunities, one for minority and women-owned businesses in clean energy, and then another one focused in on workforce equity implementation. So community groups or training organizations who have ideas and who can help reduce barriers, whether it's providing stipends for the family in New Bedford that needs childcare or that needs transportation or that needs some other wraparound services. We need to work at these structural impediments in a very focused way, and that's what we're committed to doing at Mass CEC.
Thank you. All right. So kind of changing topics a little bit. I think everybody pretty much acknowledged one of the big barriers for offshore wind is the grid. How do we connect this power to the grid? So what are the main logistical and technical challenges that you see to connecting offshore wind to the grid? And how are you or your company or your organization, how are you maybe addressing that? Or if maybe you're not actively addressing it, how do you think it should be addressed? And Vanden, why don't we start with you? Take turns.
Thank you. So this is a topic that's very near and dear to me. We often hear, 3-4 years ago, it was my job to convince people to understand the value of transmission. And it wasn't, folks didn't appreciate it. Folks about 3 to 4 years ago thought that, you can have distributed resources, whether it's large or small. And maybe, the grid doesn't need that much investment. You're over investing in the grid. But today, there is a unanimous agreement, even from people like Bill Gates, who had a talk about it, that you need to invest in transmission, and that's very refreshing. In New England, what we're doing is taking it one step further, and I'll use an example on the Cape. To interconnect Vineyard Wind's second project. The first one is interconnecting at a location which has adequate hosting capacity. The grid can accept the 800 megawatts and have a contingency during storms and still keep the lights on. So it's a reliable spot in the system. The investments on the grid for various other reasons have adequate hosting capacity to inject 800 megawatts. The next 800 megawatts in a very similar electrical location, almost like up the campus from the first one, does require an investment. When they came to the table to the ISO and said, we need to interconnect 800 megawatts, the ISO said, well, you need to invest about $280 million to build a new 345 kV line and a substation and this and that. And Eversource at the same time, along with the ISO, is looking at a reliability need for the region, where because of load growth, we need a 115 kV line into the region. So what we did is we co-optimized the two. Instead of building transmission twice, let's just build it once. Let's design it such that it achieves the goal of the offshore wind developer and the reliability customer. It saves cost to the wind developer, to the tune of almost $40 to $50 million. And the customers now get a 345 kV system that is more resilient and has better reliability. That co-optimization principle exists throughout New England, and we have so many opportunities to do that. So in my opinion, a challenge is looking at this in siloed manners. Let's just build transmission for wind. Let's build transmission for reliability, for solar, for aging infrastructure. An opportunity is to co-optimize all of them and find the best way to increase the hosting capacity of the onshore grid. What that does call for, and we have economists in the room and we have policymakers in the room, is something that runs against the grain for a lot of people, because it's this one entity that you're trusting to co-optimize, because you can't have too many players solving a co-optimized solution. So I think it is something that folks need to start appreciating, that collaboration is more important than siloed processes. And collaboration compared with transparency and good partnerships will really get us to a cost-effective and expeditious grid development.
All right. Thank you, Rod. That was nice. I think back on the question of scale and the idea of, well, if we're just building this much offshore wind, maybe we can plug in each project into a place in the grid. And that's kind of what's happening right now. It's like everybody builds their project, they have their extension cord and they plug it in somewhere in the grid. At some point, there are no outlets left. And I know in my analogy, if you plug in an extension cord, you're drawing power, but if it's offshore wind, we're actually giving power. But let's just think of this as extension cords plugging in with a two-way street. So the question is how much do we need to build? And when we get to that point, let's say in 2050, what will that look like? And right now, we, the United States, does not have a clear vision for what that ought to look like in 2050. There have been discussions. There's a lot of intense work going on in this. Regions have thought about it for themselves. Tufts is in the middle of collaborative work with the National Renewable Energy Lab and the Pacific Northwest National Lab to develop an understanding of what 85 gigawatt scenario would look like. 85 gigawatts of offshore wind on the East Coast injected into the East Coast grid. And that will be coming out. We'll be talking about that, hosting a convening at Tufts in late June 22nd, 23rd. Then the report from the National Renewable Energy Lab will be coming out in September. And then by December of this year, our goal at Tufts, along with our partners, Iowa State and Clemson University, is to publish a study on a 200 gigawatt scenario. A 200 gigawatt scenario is not something that we'll be able to fully optimize, but we will be able to envision and understand in terms of how does that affect the Eastern Interconnect and where are the improvements to the grid and so on and so forth. And so our conviction is that once we understand what we need to do to actually get to scale, and this brings up the question, how much offshore wind are we building? Once we have an understanding of what it means to be at that scale, then how do you get to there from here? And how do you actually move in this way? And so you may hear different things in the news, like the New Jersey State Agreement approach, or the New York Mesh Ready procurements, or the New England Transmission Initiative. And so what's very exciting is that just in the space of the last couple of years, the level of discourse on this and the level of recognition and the need for collaboration, as Vandana so rightly put it, has become much, much stronger. And I think that this is something that I would urge all of you to follow in the news and keep track of it and ask questions, and certainly ask questions of your colleagues in the room who are thinking about this, because this is something that once you have the right information, it's something that everyone can understand. You don't have to just be a power systems engineer to think about these things.
I'm going to build on your metaphor, and I was just glancing around the room because I think this is actually a great illustration. I see one outlet back here, and in a way, that what we're talking about, the challenge of getting onto the grid, it's building or even building power strips. So what you can think of is our company building power strips out there so that multiple wind farms could connect in. And then the ultimate vision to get some of those much larger goals is then you start to connect the power strips themselves offshore. So you have the ability to route power up and down the entire eastern seaboard. And that's sometimes called a backbone, something that would reinforce the capabilities of the onshore grid because it's hard to build onshore, and testament to the work that Eversource has done, because people typically don't like to see new power lines or even have their commute disrupted by the need to put a power line underground. So we're going to need to reinforce the onshore grid, but then over time, build out the initial increments. And this is what New England is looking at, and some of the states are looking at to the south as well, is building out the first components of those power strips offshore, and then enabling us to extend the grid out into the ocean. And there's somewhat surprising example. When folks think clean energy leadership, they typically don't think about Texas, but they about 20 years ago had a very proactive effort to build the grid out to get their onshore wind resource, which is far away from the demand centers, the western part of the state and up in the panhandle. And they now have more wind operating than any other state by far. So it just shows we need to have that kind of infrastructure first approach, and that's what we're working on.
Sure, buddy, pass the mic down.
Looking at the leaders of the communities of the future, one thing that's important, you're hearing this resounding need for transmission, and building an onshore grid to achieve this is going to be difficult. I would actually think about how do people, when they look at a transmission line, not think of it as a favorable asset that's achieving their clean energy goals. And until they get to that point, we're going to end up spending tons of millions of dollars trying to site that infrastructure. And in some cases, put it underground just because of that perception or lack of an understanding of what it's doing. You know, when people look at a substation, the future substations transporting clean energy, it's green electrons. So I think folks need, you know, if, you know, it's an interesting challenge, you know, siting is a big issue, but if folks can start looking at transmission and distribution infrastructure and understand that that's your medium to getting to a clean energy future, and it's a necessary infrastructure investment, you know, maybe the siting would be more easy or easier, and maybe the cost ultimately would be less, you know. So I just wanted to introduce that because, you know, we're talking about the grid and something that the students here can be a part of as they go out into the work.
That's a really good point. Perception. Yeah, Bruce, why don't you finish us up on this question?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I can't emphasize enough about the challenges associated with transmission, particularly what we call point of connection, interconnection. Essentially, if you're talking about offshore wind, it's that point where the export cable from the wind farm meets the onshore grid or close to it. That has been for offshore wind among the many or sort of key, sort of highly contentious sort of local stakeholder concern issues. Just to put it sort of frankly, it's a not in my backyard problem. And there are so many engineering reasons why we should be maximizing and making our transmission more efficient. And that's just one of them. But on that other topic, the interconnections that we've been seeing for the sort of first generation of offshore wind projects are what we call these generator lead lines from the wind farm to the point of interconnection. The wind farms have been close enough to shore that they've been able to use high voltage AC technology, a little bit less expensive and don't need to transform it. The future is undoubtedly HVDC. It's more efficient and for many, many reasons. But and Peter and others can, Vondan can probably speak to this, but there are still technical challenges associated with HVDC that need to be solved. And then there's going to be policy and planning. And to sort of put it simply, we need to start now planning for the system of 2035, because it will take 10 years to figure out all of the complexities associated with that. And I'm proud to say that, you know, New England is part of states, part of regional efforts to do just that. I won't take up any time, but just to, you know, say that New England states have a long history of working very closely together, and we've recently submitted a proposal to Department of Energy to help advance HVDC solutions for offshore wind.
All right. So we've got, I think, 10 minutes left, or 10 minutes for questions. Okay, so we'll end rapid fire with a really quick, hopefully easy question. And that is, what are you most looking forward to in this upcoming year in terms of developments in the offshore wind space? So give me 2 sentences or less. What are you most looking forward to this year? And why don't we start with Dr. Hines?
I'm most looking forward to the work that our new state administration is getting ready to do. It's very exciting. We have now in the governor's office and who we have in her cabinet. And we have a lot of excitement and enthusiasm about what they're planning on doing and how they're planning on positioning Massachusetts and moving our climate agenda forward.
All right, Peter, I'm going to go to you.
Would like to see Massachusetts work with the other New England states to start buying the first of these power strips out into the ocean.
I'd like to participate in these academic conversations as well to educate the entire New England stakeholder body on the role of the onshore grid, so they can be part of the solution.
I'm excited to see the nation's first commercial scale offshore wind project move into construction installation. I'm excited to see big, huge steel and fiberglass and carbon components arrive in New Bedford. I'm excited to see dozens and dozens and dozens of workers from all sorts of different backgrounds and communities on site in New Bedford in their yellow gear, their hard hats, and their steel-toed boots, pre-assembling and readying these components for installation. And then I'm excited to see where Vineyard Wind flips a switch and we get electrons from clean renewable energy from offshore wind flowing into the power grid.
And with that, I'm super excited. I don't know about you guys, but I'm very excited now. So we are going to turn it over to audience questions. Let's see. Do we have a third mic, or are we just going to shout them out?
Repeat the question.
Okay, I can do that. I can repeat things. All right.
Where are the projects currently being built, and how many of them actually are there like happening?
Okay, so for our Zoom friends, I don't know if you heard that. Where are the projects? Where are they happening? And how many of them are, far along within the development pipeline? And we'll be a little more free with our questions. So who wants to take this first? We'll do it by volunteers. All right. I think Bruce, do you want to take, or?
So in New England, 3,200 megawatts are under contract, but the first one, there are 2 projects that are active construction, and Vineyard Wind has an 800 megawatt project connecting on the Cape. The lease area is off the coast of Massachusetts.
Feel free to use the map. I know we don't have the lease areas there, but
yeah,
the lease area is here.
Right around here is the lease area, and it's interconnecting into Barnstable on the Cape. And the other project, Revolution Wind, is interconnecting into Davisville.
It's green area.
Here, the laser pointer is here if you would like to use it.
So Barnstable is the green area right there. And the Rhode Island projects interconnecting in the white area. And there's 2 other projects that are also under contract. Peter, maybe you can talk about Somerset.
Sure. So yeah, the wind farms are all going to be right here behind Professor Hines' head, the first round of them. And then in the future, they're talking about the Gulf of Maine. That will come next because the water is deeper. And that's this massive area, stretches all the way from Maine down to where the shadow of my finger is. And the project that we worked on and the sold project to Mayflower Wind is coming into that little point that I pointed out before, right on the Mass Rhode Island border.
So one point to remember is New England traditionally has had a lot of power plants along the coast. So those are some of the outlets that are currently being utilized. You asked where are they're naturally coming to the existing outlets that are available with retiring coal plants like Peter mentioned and other existing outlets. That's the first tranche.
With the pledge.
I mentioned the question of resilience in the face of climate change and extreme weather. And I'm also wondering, all of this talk of massive development and scaling, I recognize that we have massive energy needs, that we're transitioning off. I'm wondering this of massive development. When I think about the United States and building massive dams that are now drying up, and I'm wondering, is there not the place for small scale? I don't think there is. Is there not a role for small scale development of these smaller energy systems? And does wind, we're hearing about not thinking about small scale, small.
Yeah, so for our Zoom friends, we have a question about resilience and maybe the role of smaller scale development as opposed to these very large scale developments, maybe even microgrids, but small scale and resilience and how that plays into it. So Bruce, it looks like you want to take that.
Yeah, great question. And I think it's sort of yes to all. I think you need to realize here in New England, especially, there's no way we can generate the renewable power that we need unless we have scaled generation. It's just a matter of fact. When the Commonwealth looked at the decarbonization pathways, if we can't build offshore wind, we can build nuclear. So that's essentially your trade-off. That said, a couple things. On scale generation, bigger turbines mean fewer turbines. So there's a point there. The second is just on a completely other side is that there's also a need and importance for smaller scale generation, distributed solar, geothermal projects, hardening and creating these grids that are going to be super resilient for high priority institutions and assets. So yes, it's sort of all of the above, but to your point, I understand the trepidation, if you will, of big infrastructure out in the water. I came to this from a sort of environmental management, coastal resource background, and it's taken me a long time to get to the point where I know that we need to do this. So just one last point, Gulf of Maine, we talked about it. Just ended, I think, 12 out of the last 16 years broke the previous year's record in terms of thermal warming in the Gulf of Maine. Things are happening, not good things. We need to get off of this carbonization generation, and we need to do it quickly. So that's the other sort of argument for scale. So it is tough, very, very tough. You raised really great points, but I hope my response was somewhat responsive.
Well, we're running a little out of time. I'd like to get one more question in. However, if you want to say something very quickly.
All I wanted to say is yesterday's panel spoke about this bit on solar, but today New England has 5,000 megawatts of solar. The majority of it is behind the meter. It's at homes, it's at residents, and there's tons of incentives to put storage and solar in at least in Connecticut and Massachusetts. So you're going to see a good portion of the future energy mix, a pretty good 20–30%. That's at the micro level. And this is what makes up the rest of the pie.
Yeah, and if you are interested, if you didn't catch yesterday's panel, all of our panels have been recorded and they will be posted. So if you missed anything yesterday, you can go back and watch it. So, all right, we have time for one more question. I think our friend in red has been waiting a while, so.
So just jumping on Dr. Pine's excitement for the next year, I'm wondering if you and others on the panel can speak to what you'd like to see from the Healy administration from the State House, these topics next year.
Okay, so the question is, what are we hoping to see from the new Massachusetts administration and what are we excited about? So Dr. Hines, why don't you take it?
Well, our understanding is that Governor Healy has appointed climate chief Melissa Hoffer and issued an executive order to give her 180 days to assess all of the climate assets and plans in Massachusetts and come up with an all of government approach to realizing our climate goals, which include our energy justice goals. So I think we're eagerly anticipating results from that work. I think that we are excited about the commitments that Governor Healy made on the campaign trail and since issued regarding offshore wind. And we think that these are resonant with the most recent legislation that was passed in Massachusetts and signed by Governor Baker in August of 2020. And I think you couple these with what Bruce was talking about in terms of the construction of the first commercial scale offshore wind farm and people actually seeing this in reality and beginning to develop a visceral feeling. I think that 2023 is going to be a time of a lot of activity, more activity than any one of us can keep track of by ourselves. And I think that this administration has made it clear that they're committed not only to acting as stewards on this issue, but also to leading on this issue. And so we're anxious to see that unfold and see what that looks like in a year.
All right, yeah, Peter, you can have the last word.
Very quick. I think Professor Hines got it. It's implementation. Have a lot of good policies in place. There could be improvements in certain locations, policy front, but we've got the decarbonization goals, we've got authorizations, and it's now about implementation. So Governor Healy just put out a proposed budget that for the first time allocates 1% of the state budget to the environment. And that's going to mean resourcing up these agencies and hiring. So maybe final word, watch that space, go look, because the Commonwealth is going to need good, motivated folks to help them implement all the policies they have in place.
All right, thank you all so much. I believe we are at time, maybe a little bit over, so apologies for that, but this was a super engaging panel. Thank you all so much for coming and taking time out of your day to answer questions, and thank you all for coming and asking even more questions. So with that, I think we are concluded.